Good evening. My name is Jolanta Zindul, and I work in the museum, and I'm a host of this series, all the new questions in Jewish history. Our today's guest is David Biale, Emanuel Ringelblum Distinguished Professor of Jewish History at the University of California, Davis. He's a specialist in the Jewish intellectual and cultural history, in the European intellectual history, and in the history of Judaism. Let me name at least a couple of his books, like Power and Powerlessness in Jewish History, Eros and the Jews, and Blood and Belief, the circulation of a symbol between Christianity and Judaism from 2007, or Not in the Heavens, the tradition of Jewish secular thought from 2010. But today's lecture is connected with another book which Professor Biale edited, Cultures of the Jews, a New History from 2002. And I know that the Jewish Historical Institute prepares just now the translation of that book. The title of our today's lecture is A People That Dwells Alone, Jewish History and the Culture of Minority. And in fact, this is one of the most important questions in Jewish history, and namely the question about the separateness and coexistence of the Jewish minority with the majority, coexistence between Jewish minority and the Christian and Islam majorities in different countries. So the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be back in Warsaw and to speak to you here in this museum. I think that I just spent the afternoon yesterday in the core exhibition of the museum, and I was very impressed by how the museum illustrates exactly what I want to describe today, namely the way in which a minority, the Jews in this case, establishes its own identity by a constant process of cultural interaction with the culture of the majority. An interaction that involves both borrowing from that culture, but also changing it, transforming it, and sometimes also resisting that culture. And this is in fact, the thesis of this collection that I edited, Cultures of the Jews, which covers Jewish cultures from throughout the history of the Jews, namely for 3,000 years. What I'm going to do today is give you a kind of overview of this question of the relationship of the Jews to the other cultures among whom they lived. We will start with the Bible, but we will move rather rapidly through the rabbinic period, the Hellenistic Roman period, to the Middle Ages, and then we will focus towards the end on a very specific issue having to do with the Jews of Eastern Europe, and maybe even more specifically Poland. So, this question of the relationship of the Jews as a minority to majority cultures is a question both of ideology on the one side and actual social life on the other. And oftentimes we find a real tension, even a conflict between the social life of the Jews and their own ideology, their own identity. So when we start in the Bible has what I would call an ideology of separatism or self-segregation. We read three texts. These are famous texts. Behold, a people that dwells alone and is not counted among the nations. This is in the book of Numbers. in the book of Deuteronomy, this is the so-called ban on intermarriage with the Canaanite peoples. You shall not marry with them, do not give your daughters to their sons, or their sons to your daughters, or their sons to your daughters. And finally, in the book of Leviticus, you shall not copy the practices of the land of Egypt where you dwelt, that is, in the past. This is supposedly when the children of Israel are in the desert, nor of the land of Canaan to which I am taking you, nor shall you follow their laws. This last text is going to be particularly important because the question is going to be not just a question of religion, but also a question of culture. And this is a distinction that is very important in the book Cultures of the Jews. Religion is one part of culture, but it is not the only part of the story. Culture is much broader. We will see that culture includes such things as the clothing one wears. What I would like to do is to start with a specific illustration about these, how these principles or ideologies of separatism are actually lived in real life in the biblical times. Now, archaeologists tell us that the culture of the ancient Israelites was in fact the culture of the Canaanites. In other words, culturally, there was very little difference between them in terms of material culture. There was also less difference between them and the Canaanites in terms of religion, because much of the Israelite religion was borrowed from the Canaanites. The most important cultic sites were Canaanite. A number of the names of the Israelite God were Canaanite names. And so there is much more cultural interaction than these texts would lead you to believe. If we look at the second of these laws that prohibits intermarriage, it turns out this is a law that was probably never followed. If it was followed, it was very, very late in the Israelite period, in the First Temple period, perhaps the end of the 7th century, but earlier it was not followed. And I want to give an illustration of this. This wonderful picture is not, of course, from biblical times. It is from the early 17th century. It illustrates King David, here he is, and his general, Uriah the Hittite, who, if you remember the story in the Bible, David has his eye on Uriah's wife, Bathsheba. He has seen her taking a bath on the roof, and he wishes to possess her. And so he sends her husband Uriah to the front where he will be killed, and then David can take possession of his wife. Now, what I want to focus on is something very interesting, and that is Uriah's ethnic identity. He is a Hittite. A Hittite. Now, in the law, in the book of Deuteronomy that we just read, the Hittites are one of the 7 nations among whom you should not marry. So why is it then that that David's leading general is a Hittite, and moreover is married to an Israelite woman? And what this illustrates to us, I think, is that the law, the ban in Deuteronomy on intermarriage with these 7 nations, including the Hittites, was not observed during much of the biblical period, perhaps even all of the biblical period. So we have the ideology on the one hand, and we have on the other hand the actual way in which these people lived. Now, when we move forward to the Hellenistic Roman period, we find here too that the ideology of separatism is not necessarily observed in practice. So the Talmud, that is the big compendium of rabbinic texts, is very concerned with keeping distance from idolaters. And they go into great detail about different types of idolatrous practice. But in fact, it would appear that they also ignored these laws. And this is a Roman bath, of course, a Roman bathhouse, and it has various statues around here that would decorate the bath. There is a story in the Talmud about one of the most important rabbis, in fact, the leader of the rabbinical group called Rabban Gamliel, and he was seen in the bath. So a Greek philosopher approached him and said, now why are you in the bath? Doesn't your law forbid you from using the bath? And Gamliel says, well, I can discuss this with you, but not in the bath. We should go outside. If we're discussing matters of Torah, that is of Jewish law, we will do this outside of the bath. So he goes outside of the bath and he says, you see, I was not being worshipping idolatry, because even though there was a statue of Aphrodite in the bath, I did not come into her domain, she came into my domain. In other words, his domain, he says, is the Roman bath. Now, of course, if you go in the Roman bath, then you take off all your clothes. So this is going to be an interesting question. In other words, according to Talmudic law, one should behave modestly, and yet he goes in the bath and we presume takes off all of his clothes. Now, I think that what the story illustrates is that his approach to the question of idolatry is to turn it into what we would call secular art. That is, the statue of Aphrodite is not a goddess, but is rather just an ornamentation. It decorates the bath. It has no religious meaning. Of course, this is nonsense. The statue does have religious meaning. But it's very interesting that the Talmud makes this kind of move, this interpretive move, and in the process it creates a sphere which is, we would call a neutral sphere. It is neither idolatrous nor necessarily Jewish in a religious sense. It is a sphere of what we would call perhaps secular culture. So another example of this is the floors of synagogues in this primarily Byzantine period in the land of Israel. And in a way, this is a kind of an ancient illustration of what you can find right here in the museum, namely the ceiling of the painted synagogue, which was recreated here, and which shows a certain overlap or resemblance to painted churches. Namely, the Jews were borrowing certain kinds of visual ornamentation from their neighbors. And the same was true here in the Hellenistic, with the late Hellenistic, or actually Byzantine period. This is the floor of the famous synagogue in Beit Alpha in the Jezreel Valley in the land of Israel. We have here the signs of the zodiac, also borrowed, as well as in the middle, this is the god Helios, with his chariot. So once again, a Greek god borrowed for a, in this case, it's actually not in a bath, but it's actually in a synagogue, in a Jewish ritual space. And yet they are able to embrace or adopt these non-Jewish symbols for a Jewish ritual purpose. Some argue that they reinterpreted Helios here to stand for the Messiah, which may be the case. It's very hard to say. But it is very interesting that even within a synagogue, you would find this kind of decoration. And this is discussed in the Talmud, that in a certain period, evidently the Byzantine period, the Jews began to ornament their synagogues using Greek motifs, and the rabbis did not object. So again, an example of a kind of tension, you would say, between the laws against idolatry and, on the other hand, the actual practice, which is something very different. Now, there is a famous rabbinic midrash, commentary or interpretation, which says that the Israelites were preserved in Egypt because they did not change their names, their language, did not violate the sexual prohibitions, and did not change their clothing. Now, it actually appears in a number of different places in different versions. I've put them a bit together, so this is not an exact word-for-word translation, but this is, these are some of the ideas. Now, what does this mean? So, according to the Bible, the ancient Israelites were in Egypt for 430 years. How could it be that they didn't disappear? They didn't assimilate. They didn't become part of Egyptian society. And according to the later rabbis, the reason is they kept their names, they kept their language, they didn't violate sexual prohibitions, did not change their clothing. Now, it's pretty clear that what the rabbis are doing here is they're making a commentary on their own time, when in fact the Jews did all of these things. They took Greek names. They, in many cases, took the Greek language. Violate sexual prohibitions means, in this case, that they did not intermarry, and we have certainly examples of intermarriage. We will discuss clothing in just a moment. Now, it's also the case that even in ancient Egypt, as far as we can tell, they violated all of these. For example, a number of the primary biblical names are in fact Egyptian. The name Moses is an Egyptian name. So even in terms of ancient history, this is not true. But this is going to be a very interesting, this statement is actually later interpreted by rabbis, for example, in the 19th century, to be a kind of law. That is, you should not change your name, you should not change your language, and in particular, you should not change your clothing. And we'll come back to that in just a moment. So I want to talk about clothing. We're going to focus on that from now on in this talk. We know very, very little about what Jewish clothing looked like in the Talmudic or rabbinic period. There is some evidence that rabbis wore a talit, a fringe garment, but it's only rabbis, it seems. There is a discussion of a particular type of idolatrous head or hairstyle, which is called the blorit. Now, nobody knows what this actually looked like, but you were warned not to wear your hair in a blorit. Now, this is now a bit of an aside. I now go to the middle of the 20th century, and in Zionist Hebrew culture in Israel, the blorit was considered the mark of a handsome man. And here is one of the main figures who's known for his blorit. This is Yitzhak Rabin, when he was a commander in the Palmach in the 1948 war. And this is interesting. In other words, this symbol of the ancient idolater becomes now the symbol of the modern Israeli. So this tells you something about how things sometimes get turned upside down. Let's now go to the Middle Ages, where we do have more evidence because we have iconographic, we have some visual evidence. And this is a wonderful small silver box, which is in the Israel Museum from about 1475. And this box, which I discuss in Cultures of the Jews, so soon, hopefully, you'll have it in Polish, and you'll be able to read it there. This is an absolutely wonderful box, not very big. It has these dials on top, which evidently were for, this was to be given to a Jewish woman on her marriage. She would keep, it seems, the keys to her wardrobe in the box. Presumably so that, and here is and I guess she would wear the key to the box around her neck, and some think that perhaps this was in order to prevent her servants from stealing her clothing, and she could mark the numbers of each different type of clothing or linen in her closets. These have numbers with the letters of the Hebrew alphabet. Now, on the front of it, we have a depiction of the 3 primary commandments for Jewish women. This is the lighting of the Sabbath candle. It's not that easy to see. This is the purifying herself after her menstrual period in the ritual bath. And here is the kneading of the challah, the bread for the Sabbath. So what I'm interested in now is the clothing, or in case of the middle one, the lack of clothing. It's very interesting that in this culture in northern Italy, this is northern Italy, I think it's Ferrara, that depicting a naked woman is not a problem. Their idea of modesty is apparently borrowed from their cultural surrounding. That is, depiction of a naked woman is acceptable, which would not be necessarily in other Jewish cultures, and certainly not today among Orthodox Jews. We see her in her bath here. It's really wonderful. Like Gamliel, you have to go in the ritual bath unclothed, fully naked. And here we have garments that the woman is wearing, which are, according to the experts, I'm not an expert on Jewish clothing, but these are actually fashions that one would find about 75 years earlier than this box. So the Jewish women were following the fashion of their day, but about 75 years too late. So here we have a very good example of how Jewish clothing resembled that of the surroundings. Now, in 1215, so several hundred years earlier, the Fourth Lateran Council, this pontifical council, issues certain regulations for Jews. The Jews, we are told, should wear some kind of insignia on their clothing so they could be told apart from Christians. Why was this? Another regulation seems to tell us why. It's because to prevent Jews and non-Jews from having sexual relations. So again, to go back to what we said earlier, they didn't violate the sexual prohibitions. Apparently they did. That is, they were having relations with their non-Jewish neighbors. And the church felt it was essential to prevent this by requiring the Jews to wear something on their clothing which would distinguish them from the non-Jews. It tells you also that Jews looked very much like their Christian neighbors. They were not so easily distinguished. The prejudice that we have maybe in the modern period, Jews look different, this doesn't seem to necessarily be true through much of Jewish history. So here we have an example of Jewish hat, which one can find in many depictions of the Jews. It's, by the way, very interesting that even in Jewish illuminated manuscripts, the illustrators would sometimes portray the Jews wearing the Jewish hat. In other words, the Jews embraced this as part of their costume. And here we have another type of Jewish insignia, this round symbol here, which distinguishes the Jews from their neighbors. And clearly, their clothing otherwise is exactly the same clothing as that of their neighbors. So this is, I think, a very interesting example that the rabbinic midrash, they did not change their clothing, is certainly not true in the Middle Ages. They have adopted the clothing of the surroundings. So now we move to, I promised you we would come to Poland, and I want to focus now on a specific problem in Jewish clothing, which is connected to another project on which I'm engaged right now. I've been working with a team of 8 other scholars writing the first history of Hasidism. We're actually done with this project and hopefully be published in a year and maybe even in Polish. So one of the really interesting problems to deal with is, how do these Hasidim get their clothing? Where does it come from? This is a particular Hasidic group. I believe that it is the Satmar group. And you can see, of course, the famous Streimel hat, which are worn by the men, the long coat, capote, the white socks in the case of this particular group. I won't speak about the women's clothing here right now, but we can return to it in the questions if you're interested. So where did they get this clothing? According to them, of course, because they believe in the rabbinic saying that they did not change their clothing, that they have always worn this. And it's nothing new. But if we, take a look at portraits of Polish nobility from the 18th century, we see there's some similarities, the long coat certainly, in some cases also the fur hat. Some think that indeed this clothing was taken from fashions of the Polish nobility. In any case, from the late 18th century, we also find this, by the way, those who have gone through the exhibition here in the museum will recognize that this Norblom painting has been used in the museum, I think, quite effectively. So this is a Jewish family, or at least mother and children. And this boy here is dressed pretty much in what we would consider Hasidic costume. but there is no reason to believe he is necessarily a Hasid. First of all, at the time when Norblom does this picture around the year 1800, it seems, there aren't so many Hasidim. So it's possible that he belongs to this particular branch of Judaism, but it seems that all Polish Jews dress this way, pretty much, in this period, to judge by other pictures that we have. So the question then is, how does it become the Hasidic dress? And as far as we know, the only thing that distinguishes the Hasidim from other Jews up to the middle of the 19th century is the way their leaders dress. So this is Menachem Mendel Schneerson, the third leader of the Lubavitch or Chabad group of Hasidim. He is wearing a white gown, and this is, in fact, we know from the sources, the Hasidic leaders called Rebbe in Yiddish or Tzaddik in Hebrew. This is how they dressed on the Sabbath, because this white garment was the dress adopted by the earlier Kabbalists, the earlier Jewish mystics. And they adopt this, and this is how the leader distinguishes himself from his followers. But it is the only form of Hasidic dress that we know from written sources which distinguish the Hasidim. All these other forms, for example, the shtreimel, the kapota, the long coat, these are not classically Hasidic. They're not referred to in Hasidic texts. One thing that is referred to actually is the belt, or what's called the gartel. And this is explained as separating the upper part of the body, which is more spiritual, from the lower part of the body, which is more material. But otherwise, we don't have any kind of description of Hasidic dress up until around the middle of the 19th century. What happens in the middle of the 19th century? What happens is a number of dress decrees issued by the Tsarist government in both Russia and in Poland to force the Jews to adopt different forms of modern dress. These are two examples that were offered to the Jews as models of how they should dress. And what appears to be the case is that most Jews gradually, perhaps not immediately, these dress decrees were not necessarily followed immediately, but gradually the Jews now begin to change their clothing and to adopt Russian, Polish forms of dress or fashion from the middle of the 19th century, except for the Hasidim. The Hasidim decide that this is going to be the basis for resisting the government. And here they go back, sometimes explicitly, to that statement in the Midrash that the Israelites did not change their clothing, and so they were preserved. And in this case, they say, we will not change our clothing. We will stay with our traditional clothing, which is to say clothing probably that comes from the 18th century. And gradually, as the second half of the 19th century comes close to the 20th century, they begin to distinguish themselves from other Jews by this kind of clothing. And then there's another stage of the development, which is that they distinguish each group from the other by the type of clothing. So, for example, to go back to what we saw before, the wearing socks of this kind, white socks on the Sabbath, this particular shape of the shtreimel. This will distinguish a particular court or dynasty, whether it be Ger or Belz or Satmar. I'm just mentioning three groups that are very prominent still today. Each of these groups will have its own form of this dress, which it develops on its own to distinguish itself from other groups. It's what Sigmund Freud called the narcissism of small differences. And so you dress according to the way your group dresses. Now, it's interesting to take a look at what other Orthodox Jews do with the question of clothing. So the Hasidim symbolize their resistance to modernity by not changing their clothing and actually even intensifying their clothing, as we've just seen. But a number of very important Orthodox authorities do not agree with this direction. So Moshe Feinstein, probably the greatest, we would call him ultra-Orthodox authority of the 20th century in America, legal authority that is, he issued a ruling that to wear a modern suit, as he is wearing here, you can see he's wearing a tie and a white shirt, and presumably when he gets up out of his chair, he'll put on a dark jacket. To wear a modern suit is not idolatrous, he says. He goes back to that statement in the book of Leviticus, you should not follow the practices of the Egyptians or the Canaanites. Those are idolatrous practices. He says wearing a suit is not an idolatrous practice because it is neutral. It's neither Jewish nor idolatrous. And this is in a way what Gamliel says about the bath. It's a neutral space. It's secular. It doesn't mean anything one way or the other. You can wear the suit without being seen necessarily as an idolater. Another authority from the 20th century, this is Ovadia Yosef. He was the chief Sephardic rabbi of Israel up until just a short while ago. He lived more or less forever and died at age 100 and something. And so he agreed with Moshe Feinstein. He said it is not necessary to keep the same clothing. You can wear modern clothing. But he drew the line at miniskirts. It's not acceptable. Otherwise, any modern clothing is acceptable, according to Feinstein. Another interesting variant on this brings us back to Hasidism, and that is, I'll just show you this. So this is a picture of how modern Orthodox boys dress. That is, you wouldn't know that their dress is any different from anyone else's, except, of course, they wearing the talit, here in praying, other Jewish symbols, but otherwise their dress is entirely modern. Now, this gentleman, who may be known to you, Menachem Mendel Schneerson, the seventh rabbi of the Lubavitch or Chabad branch of Hasidism. Now, as you can see, his beard is a kind of modern beard. We haven't spoken about the beard here. That's a whole subject for another lecture, the fashion of the beard. But Schneerson wears a trimmed beard. This is when he's relatively young. And he wore what's called a fedora hat. This is before he becomes the leader of the Chabad or Lubavitch movement. So his father-in-law, who was the sixth Rebbe of Lubavitch, one of his primary sort of arguments is he argued against wearing modern dress. Not only modern dress, he also said it is forbidden to trim your beard, for a man, obviously, to trim your beard. And when he was making these sermons, his son-in-law was living in his house, and he looked like this. So it's a very interesting kind of contradiction. But when Schneerson becomes, this is somewhat older, when he becomes the leader of the Lubavitch Chabad movement, he grows his beard, so he's following now his father-in-law, but he keeps the fedora hat. So this is very interesting because what he should have done, like all the other Hasidic groups, he should have worn a shtreimel, the fur hat. But he preserves a kind of a symbol of his more modern dress in the form of fedora hat. And then you can see that all of his followers wear the same hat. The guy in the middle is not a Chabad Hasid. I don't know who he is. So this is interesting because you can see the Chabad, they are a very interesting movement. I'm sure you have a Chabad house here in Warsaw. They're everywhere. They go out and missionize among Jews everywhere in the world. And they are, in a sense, more open to the modern world. And one of the ways in which they symbolize this is by wearing a hat which distinguishes them from all other Hasidic groups and from, in a way, all other Orthodox Jews. So this is, again, using clothing to distinguish between different groups within this movement of Hasidism and also as forms of Jewish dress that they have adopted, even though, of course, now they don't look at anything like the Polish nobility that we saw in an earlier slide. So what I'd like to do is to conclude by shifting from dress to food. And unfortunately, my friend and colleague, Barbara Kirschenblatt-Gimblet, is not here. She's on the island of Lesbos, I think receiving a prize for the museum. But she is, of course, for those who know her, she's a great expert on Jewish food. So I put this slide in with the hopes that she would be here, but she's not, so we'll talk about it anyway. So, and this will bring us back to where we began, that is the land of Israel. So this is, many people now consider this a Jewish food, the falafel in pita. Of course, it is not originally Jewish at all. It is Arab dish, in which was embraced by the modern nation of Israel. Its society embraces this as its main cuisine or its kind of signature cuisine. It appears that this only happens somehow after 1948, which is kind of interesting. It happens after most of the Palestinian Arabs are no longer there, that it becomes the symbol, and it, in a sense, has been taken away from its origins as an Arabic food. But there is one really interesting feature of this that I think symbolizes the argument I'm trying to make here today, and that is the word pita. So pita is not an Arabic word. This actually is a Hebrew word, pita. Where does it come from? Well, it is a good instance of a kind of linguistic syncretism, that is where the Jews have taken, particularly in creating modern Hebrew, they take certain words which have origins in the non-Jewish world, have some sound that's like an old Hebrew word, and they make a new word out of it. So what are these? So The Hebrew word is pat lechem, that is a loaf of bread, or a piece of bread. But the word equally may come from the same root as pan, that is, as bread from Romance languages. It's probably the origin of the root of the word pizza. All of these words now come together in the word pita, a Hebrew invention that is nevertheless based on two different cultures, ancient Jewish culture and the culture of the surroundings. And so one can only hope that this kind of syncretism in terms of cuisine will also herald sometime in the near future political harmony between the Jews and their neighbors. But in any case, the argument that I've been trying to make here is that Jewish culture is never one that stands alone, that is isolated from its surroundings, but rather it's always an interaction, and in which culture is a much broader sphere in which a people can negotiate its relationship with its neighbors. Thank you very much.
Good comment on the women clothing.
Okay, yes.
It was very interesting.
Yeah, yeah. So, yes, so I mean, we can go back. Yes, so the women's clothing, of course, there is a legal commandment, really, for modesty. And this is interpreted differently in different Jewish cultures. It's not always exactly the same. In other words, what does a woman show in terms of, for example, the length of the dress is very interesting. These women are quite stylish, and you find that among certain Hasidic groups. The women dress very well in a certain kind of fashion that is what's called a Haredi or Ultra-Orthodox fashion. There are certain groups, primarily those from Hungary, the Toldot Aharon group in particular, who women are not allowed to dress in a fashionable way. They have to actually conceal as much as possible of their bodies. So this group is a little bit more open. The women, a married woman must cover her hair. That's already biblical. And the question is, how does she cover her hair? In some of these groups, many of them actually, once she is married, she must cut off her hair. So this girl is obviously not married yet. She must cut off her hair, and she typically will wear what's called a shaitel, a wig, which was quite controversial when it came in, which was in the 19th century. It's not before the 19th century, this wig. And it was called in Hebrew, peah nochrit, a Gentile wig. So there was controversy about it, and there's still some controversy today. There are certain groups, like these Hungarian groups, where they will not wear such a wig. They will actually shave their head and then cover it with a very tight scarf. Here, I can't tell if that's what they're wearing, but they have covered it. In certain groups, it's considered sufficient to wear this wig. You don't have to actually then wear a scarf on top of it as well, which is kind of interesting because some of these wigs are done so well that you can't tell that it's a wig. And so it defeats the purpose. And that's why in certain groups, you nevertheless will cover it up. So I'm not sure what's going on here with this particular group, if they are wearing such a wig or not.
When was it done, this picture?
Oh, I think that this picture is not so old. I think it's maybe No, I think even later. I think it could easily be in the last decade or two. Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I'm trying to see actually who this guy is in the picture. That might help us, but I can't see it well enough. I don't think it's Schneerson. These guys, they're not dressed like, they're not. This is not the way Chabad dresses.
This man on the picture.
Well, I know, but I think I don't think it's Schneerson. I find that very hard to believe. I know it looks like it a little bit, but remember, if you have a old rabbi who has a long beard, it may be hard to tell one from the other. I find it very hard to believe that would be Schneerson because the Chabad does not dress this way. So, but I would have to examine this much more closely. I agree with you that it looks like it might be. I don't think it is.
I would like to ask you because what you started this was that the different dress was supposed to help the Jews to preserve, let's say, and what you say that they are like this 75 years followers. I mean 75 years later, but looking at all those pictures and paintings. For me, at least, there is no doubt that we see Jewish people there. Yeah, so they, in a way, really look different from the others. So my question is, do you think it really helped them to preserve, to being so different, to really build this natural border that will prevent the interbreeding, let's say?
Well, I think that every group that wants to keep its identity has to have ways of doing this, and obviously the Jewish religion, up until modern times, was one way of preserving this difference. I think that the borders between Jews and non-Jews was never as firm and clear as we think it was, And oftentimes there is an attempt made to insist that it's there because it really isn't there exactly. Now, of course, there's a difference, and of course, Jews know who they are, they know who the others are, but there is a realm in which they interact. And it varies according to the different cultures. There's a realm in which they interact, which, creates possibilities for interaction. I'll give you an example that's actually from genetic science. So it turns out, you can study the if a particular type of identity goes through the father, you can study it on the Y chromosome. So it turns out that the Levite identity, this is the priestly, the sort of larger group of priests, the Kohanim is a smaller group, the Levite identity can be traced back to a non-Jewish man in southeastern Europe. Excuse me, I should say this better. The Levite identity for Ashkenazi Jews can be traced to a non-Jewish man in southeastern Europe. How is this possible? Because it goes through the line, the male line. Well, what seems to be the case is that a non-Jew must have either converted or had relations with a Jewish woman, and somehow their son was identified as a Levite. And because of the way genetics works, it can be traced back to that person. So this is a really kind of a striking case of showing you that the borders, we tend to think that the sexual borders between peoples are very firm. You know, people will not have relations, but that turns out not to be true. And so, I mean, you say, well, you can tell that these people are Jewish. Well, I don't know. I mean, I think that if you have some stereotype of what a Jew looks like, there are many Jews who don't conform to the stereotype. They look different. They look like their neighbors. I mean, how is it that so many Polish Jews actually had blonde hair? You know? I mean, if they were all descendant from a Semitic people, you know, who only have dark hair, where did the blonde hair come from? And this is because there is a tremendous amount of intermixing. And our idea of what a Jew should look like or a Christian should look like, Pole, German, and so on, these are maybe they're true partly, but they're not true 100%.
I don't remember in which of your book, but I think Power and Powerlessness of Jews, you are mentioning your grandmother from Wrocławek.
Thank you. It's in the most recent book on secular Jewish.
Okay.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate a little bit? Because I thought it's a very interesting story.
Thank you. Yeah. So it's actually appropriate to the talk because my grandmother, who I didn't know, she died in the Holocaust. She, according to my father's story, was the first woman in the town of Wrocławek, where my father came from, to grow her own hair. In other words, instead of cutting the hair, putting on the sheitel, she grew her own hair. And I have pictures of her that show that. And my father was very proud of that because he was a completely secular Jew. But his parents were traditional Jews. They followed Jewish law. His father, my grandfather, was a leader of the Mizrahi, the religious Zionist group in the town. So these people were quite traditional, but they were already beginning the path towards secularization. And it seems that she, perhaps even more than my grandfather, was in the lead in this process. I would like to know what she was thinking, you know, why she made this decision. Was there opposition? What did her husband think of it? There are many questions I have which I can't get the answers to, but I started the book, so this book is called Not in the Heavens, The Tradition of Jewish Secular Thought. So I start the book with this story because it's a family story of secularization. The book is really about, you know, thinkers, philosophers, and so on. I mean, my grandmother was not a philosopher, but I thought it was important to situate the intellectual history, the philosophical ideas in a social reality. And the social reality is that the Jews, starting already in the 19th century, well, if we speak of the Polish Jews, already in the 19th century, are beginning to abandon religion and embrace a new kind of identity. And it's on that background that you get various ideologies of Jewish secularism. My father, for example, he belonged to the Hashomer Tzair, the socialist Zionist youth group. So he already embraced an ideology of secularism, which probably his parents did not have. But you perhaps needed this first step in order to create the possibility for the next step.
I understand from your lecture that many, as if the main force behind the separateness of the Jewish nation was religion, and you started your presentation with quotations from the Bible. Yeah, my question is, because you've been following it kind of through the ages, how would you comment on whether Jews as a nation, as a people, were more restrictive or more trying to preserve their own identity than other nations or people that they lived within larger communities? And secondly, how would you comment on the role of that religion is playing today in creating that identity, and also in trying to preserve the continuation of Jewish separatedness?
Yeah. Well, I don't think that Jewish religion plays a greater role in preserving Jewish identity than religion does for any other group. I mean, religion is, of course, up until the modern period, a very powerful form of not just identity, but also cultural practice. It's not only what one believes, but what one does, the festivals one follows, the food one eats, and so forth. All of these things are tied up with religion. Now, in the modern period, of course, this begins to dissolve, and you have the possibility of other identities that are free of religion. In the case of the Jews, there's a number of different possibilities. Some of them are nationalist in nature, that is, formulating the identity as a national, a modern secular national identity. Some are in the form of purely cultural identity. We speak in the United States sometime of cultural Jews. So what is a cultural Jew? The cultural Jew is the one who on Christmas will go and eat Chinese food and then go to a movie. And that's a Jewish cultural practice. And some people say it's actually a religion, but it's, of course, not a religion. It's a cultural practice. With respect to religion today, this is, of course, very controversial. There's a tremendous amount of debate about, in the case of the Jews, as to whether religion is necessary to preserve the identity. I would say that we don't yet know whether. Some say that only religious Jews, Orthodox Jews, will in the end remain, that all other Jews will somehow intermarry, lose a Jewish identity, and that only the Orthodox will remain. I'm speaking now of outside of the State of Israel. In the State of Israel, because Jewish identity is also an issue of citizenship, then even if you want to abandon it, it's still in your identity card. That's a different question. But some people will argue that, in principle, only the religious will survive. I don't believe that's true. I think that the nature of the Jewish experience is much broader than just religion. The history, for example, is a powerful force for identity. And so, for example, a museum like this provides a certain resources for people who want to use it for their identity. And I think it's too soon to say whether religion is the only path towards that preservation.
So, thank you.
Thank you very much
for the lecture and for the discussion.